traverse. Sorry, just doing my tech check here, which means we're about ready to go. I just want to get us started in a moment or so here. We're waiting for one more panelist to join us. Unfortunately, Angela Gonzalez, who was scheduled to be speaking with us today, is unable to join us due to a last-minute family emergency. So she won't be here. So we have a tighter panel of less speakers. So hopefully that means we'll be able to move through it a little bit more quickly. I am very excited to have this wonderful panel together. I'm a speaker, but I'll also be moderating. And we've decided to keep the intro short so that we can have more time for the presentations and discussions. So I'll just get started on the introductions here. So my name is Anita Bakshi, and I teach at Rutgers University in the Department of Landscape Architecture. I did my PhD in architecture with a group called Conflict in Cities, and I'm very interested in the representation of memory and history, which I explored in detail in my 2017 book, Topographies of Memories. And I've been working with the Ramapough Lunaape Turtle Clan on a project called Our Land, Our Stories since 2018. And Tim Blunk is the director of Gallery Bergen, which is the art space for Bergen Community College. And he's an assistant professor of visual arts. He served as the director of the Puffin Cultural Forum for 12 years. He's a former US political prisoner who served over 13 years in some of America's most notorious prisons for his activism. And he curated his first show from prison, collecting artworks from political prisoners in 17 countries from around the world. And we're also honored to have Chief Vincent Mann joining us today. He'll be joining us shortly. He's the Turtle Clan chief of the Ramapough Lunaape Nation. He's trustee of the Highlands Coalition and also a former member of the Ringwood Mines Superfund Site Community Advisory Group. He's the co-founder of the Muncie Three Sisters Medicinal Farm, which is an initiative to restore food sovereignty for the clan and to create local jobs. And he's established many, many partnerships with universities and works tirelessly to advance many causes for his people. And we're going to start our presentation today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. We're going to start our presentation today with a very short video. It's going to take about 8 minutes or so. And we hope that this video is going to help to contextualize the discussion that we really want to kick off today and move us off the established terrain on which debates about Native American identity and recognition usually take place. So it'll be about 8 minutes and we'll come back and start the panel. This book traverses a contested terrain. Historians and politicians have long contested the history of the Lunaape peoples originally from New Jersey. This contestation is an important part of this environmental justice story because it has direct implications for this community's experience with contamination and remediation, as you will hear about. In this book, we recognize that there are no definitive answers and that this is rooted in how our nation was constructed and the deliberate erasure that was involved. We recognize that histories and policies were crafted for the colonial purpose of dispersing Indigenous power. We recognize that many books that sit on our shelves today are used to eradicate the complexities of our collective American story. We recognize that those histories give some people the home court advantage. This book moves us off of that court and into a complex territory that weaves together different strands and different stories. It engages with updated evidence and more recent work from scholars of Native American and Indigenous studies that points out that not all Indigenous people left New Jersey. This book honors the lives of those who stayed on the land of their ancestors, those who kept memory alive, those who kept the names of the places alive against all odds, as they have had to deal for centuries with degrading representations of who they are. It has not been easy. I believe the Ramapough's claims of Native American heritage. I recognize that this claim is contested by some historians and some New Jersey residents. I am aware that David Cohen's book, The Ramapough Mountain People, published in 1974, is seen by some historians as the definitive last word on their ancestry. He claims that they're the descendants of Dutch men and African women. But I'm aware that a lot more evidence exists that is not included in that book. I know that Herbert C. Kraft, a respected authority on the Lunaape and professor emeritus of anthropology and the director of the Museum of Archaeology at Seton Hall, published another book 12 years after Cohen's titled The Lunaape, Archaeology, History, and Ethnography. I know that he has a very different understanding of history and that he wrote letters supporting the Ramapough's bids for official recognition. But for some reason, his carefully researched book has not managed to nudge some historians' opinions. I believe that New Jersey would not have officially recognized the Ramapough Lunaape as a state tribe unless the state had performed the proper genealogical research. This would not have happened without strong supporting evidence. I believe that every single Lunaape individual did not leave New Jersey. I believe that some stayed behind, that some couldn't bear to leave their homes. And I ask you to reflect on when and why you didn't choose to leave your home, and the cost that you may have been willing to pay to stay in the place that you loved most in the world, the place where your obligations were grounded. I believe the numerous genealogists who have gone on record to support the Ramapough's claims. I believe former Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt and his letter to the US Senate in 1995 stating that the Ramapough's claims are valid and that their case for federal recognition had been compromised when records were leaked to the Atlantic City Gaming Commission before they went to the BIA. I believe State Assemblyman William Carey Edwards' state document from 1995 supporting the Ramapough's claims and outlining the legislature's step-by-step dismissal of Cohen's book. I know that after the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was passed in 1998, anti-gambling opponents all over the country accused tribal groups of using the recognition process to move towards the ultimate goal of establishing casinos. And I know that in that same year, New Jersey State Representative Robert Torricelli, who had originally supported the Ramapough's bid for federal recognition, suddenly changed his mind because of his concerns about gaming. And in that same year, Donald Trump sued the federal government, alleging that IGRA had created unfair competition for his casinos in Atlantic City, just a 2-hour drive away from the Ramapough's homelands. He was being discriminated against. And when that suit failed, Trump went on to publicly question the Ramapough's racial identity, stating,
"They don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like Indians to Indians. And a lot of people are laughing at it, and you're telling how tough it is, how rough it is to get approved. Well, you go up to Connecticut, and you look. Now, they don't look like Indians to me, sir."
Putting those words out on the airways to seed doubt wherever it was convenient. I instead believe the historians and archaeologists and environmental scientists who support the Ramapough as a Native American tribe. I believe those who are working directly with the people, those who are in relationship with the people, and those who see them as people, not remnants of documents in colonial archives. I believe them over those who claim expertise from afar. We believe the Ramapough's oral and written histories. We know that histories are contested and that there are multiple ways of patching together archival documents. Many decades ago, Cohen did some serious scholarly work and brought pieces of evidence into play. Many of his primary sources are from the colonial archives and from sources like the Eugenics Records Office. There is other evidence out there that did not make its way into his book, which was written almost 50 years ago. And so much has changed in terms of working with rather than on Native American communities. We also know that so little has changed, and therefore many will continue to believe his account. That's okay. We just want room for contestation. We just want room to display the evidence that all the people who worked on this book have accumulated, historical documents and the voices of the people. In this book, we make room for those voices to be heard on their own terms. We make room for other evidence to be seen, and we recognize the Native peoples that our state has also officially recognized. We've created representations and visualizations of the Ramapough's history and present environmental justice struggles to create a resource for teaching. And this is just a small part of a much larger project led by the Ramapough for cultural restoration, knowledge recovery, and food sovereignty. We understand that there is controversy, and we only ask that you look and draw your own understandings from the more complete picture presented here. We ask that you engage with the broader picture sketched out about how Indian land was acquired and distributed, about how connections to Native traditions were deliberately eroded, and also about how many Native Americans today live with environmental contamination. We ask that you listen to the oral and written histories of these full and present human beings, about their connections to their lands and their histories. Well, thank you for watching this introduction to some of the themes that we'll explore in our panel today. I'm going to start us off, and then Tim Blunk will speak next and raise some questions about identity and historical authority. And we're grateful that Chief Mann will offer closing words for this panel and sort of reflect on how these debates have impacted his community. Chief Mann, I wonder if you would like to share a few words of welcome with the audience now, or if we should go to you later.
No, sure. Kiha Kolomolsi, Ninju Shinzi Kikai Man, Nunji Ai, Lamawo, Wenjikil, Lamawo Tekwa, Anishi Kishalo Moquain, Alamilia and Yonkwai Kish Creek, Wakokona Aki, Waktenda, Wakmbi, Wakilongo Matit, Waknimbu Mausawakanum, Anishik, 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 Anishik. How are you? Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Chief Mann. I'm the Turtle Clan Chief of the Ramapough people in the Ramapough Mountains. Thank you, Creator, for giving us this day, our Mother Earth, the fire and the water. We thank you for all of our relations, and we thank you for our lives. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you. And again, Anishik, to you, Anita, and Tim, for creating this space and sharing what you have collected here today. So thank you, Anishik.
Thank you, Chief Mann. It is our honor to be part of this work. So I'm going to just get my screen set up over here. I'm going to present first, and just to tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing. I've been working with the Turtle Clan for the last 4 years or so on a collaborative project that's mainly focused on landscape and environmental contamination. And we've been working to represent complex information in sort of a clear visual manner to create resources for teaching, including a book and a documentary film. And what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm just going to drop some links here in the chat to those for anyone who wants to follow up on those. So at first, when I started working on this project, I thought that I would sort of just be able to get on with the business of doing that work, but quickly realized how much interpretations of the past continue to influence the daily realities of the Ramapough. And I soon understood that it's not possible to just do that other work, because the question of identity and the doubt that it seeds comes up at every turn as the Ramapough look to engage in cultural restoration or apply for grants or work towards food sovereignty and continue to partner with academics. So in this presentation, I apply that same lens to questions of identity and recognition. And I engage in a close investigation of David Cohen's 1974 book, The Ramapough Mountain People. The book continues to be used as an authoritative source on Ramapough identity, influencing scholars, government officials, and public discourse in the region. So I examine here how Native American identity and history have been erased through the selective evidence consulted in the book, pointing out significant gaps in the argument. The analysis illustrates the difficulties that arise when scholars attempt to reconstruct Native American history, mainly through the use of colonial records, and it shows how complex histories of encounter between Native and Black peoples are flattened out to fit into neat narratives and squeezed into clearly defined categories of identity. The Ramapough have long been subject to outside accounts and speculations, as journalists and authors have been writing for a long time about wild men, savages, and outcasts living off the land in a degraded state. They were called the Ramapough Mountain People, or Mountaineers, or Jackson Whites, whatever outsiders decided was the right term. They were referred to as mongrels belonging to a degenerate race. And these depictions even found a place in children's books and tales. These local legends and stories, which people would encounter in their everyday lives in these books, were part of how negative opinions form. And this is important to point out because local histories and derogatory portrayals of this community created a fertile ground for discounting Native identities. These types of legends and myths became somewhat more official in 1936 when a local journalist, known for taking fanciful liberties with his writing, published a tale that provided an irresistible nugget of local lore, intrigue, and speculation about the origins of this community. It was a salacious tale full of outlaws and prostitutes and wanton mixing of races. This tale had exactly the kinds of elements that would have resonated with the bizarre racial imaginations of the time. The 1930s was the heyday of eugenics in America. Charles Davenport had recently formed the Eugenics Rutgers office in London. All of these degrading representations embedded into local perceptions of the community and have been hard to shake loose ever since. These have been repeated, rehearsed, and reheard so many times that it feels like fact. And even to this day, the internet is abuzz with sordid tales about this community. For example, the Weird New Jersey website had this to say in 2012. The Ramapough Mountain People book, published in 1974, provided another narrative that would play into this long-standing belief about the difference and otherness of this community. In the book, Cohen seeks to dismantle the Jackson Whites myth, writing another history of the community that denies any Native American ancestry. The book contains only a few pages that focus on Native American history, which seems to have been erased as irrelevant to the matter at hand. Granted, there wasn't much information available at the time of research, but even well-known historical facts were not mentioned, like the treaties of Crossroads and Easton. And while some information may have been difficult to find, a book published just 12 years after this volume by Herbert C. Kraft contains a fairly robust discussion of Native Americans in New Jersey. Thus, the reader is presented mainly with the origin stories of three families that are traced genealogically in the book. And after an accounting of these family trees, which only trace ancestry up to the late 1700s, a sudden leap appears in the concluding paragraph of chapter 2, which you just saw scrolling, where the chance of any Native American ancestry is minimized. While it is not clearly stated in the text, somehow the genealogical histories of these three families have been connected to the Ramapough. And the main claim is that these families are the sole ancestors of the Ramapough, but several important clarifications are missing in the text. First, is it only the similarity of last names that makes this case for ancestry? Does the author assume that because someone has a European last name, that they cannot be Native American? It certainly was not uncommon for people to adopt European names, especially if they had been Christianized. Second, No mention is made of Native Americans in New Jersey employing the use of single traditional names in recorded documents, such as land deeds. For instance, Chief Katona signed land deeds with a single name through 1743, and this was common at the time, as noted by George H. Loskew, a Moravian missionary to the Delaware Indians in 1794. And third, the genealogies that are published in the book stop in the 1700s. So was Cohen able to link the living community that he researched in the 1960s to these three families? If any such genealogical work was conducted, it is absent and unmentioned in the book. Certainly a stronger case could have been made by working the genealogies backwards from the modern people. But since Cohen was unable to make any connection between the modern and historical people, how can he be sure that these are the same people or that others did not migrate or intermingle with the families that he recorded? Beyond proving a genealogical link in the case of John Van Dunk, a lack of Native American ancestry has not been determined in Cohen's research. And the very nature of the census record itself must be considered. Even after Indian became available as a category, Native Americans along the eastern seaboard were often misidentified as mulatto or free person of color after they were baptized as Christians or adopted European last names. But in the end, Cohen is surprised by the negative reaction he receives from the Ramapough, as he writes in the epilogue to the book. This book was used in the application for federal recognition with the BIA, and considering that the book was not particularly well received by academia or other historians when it was published in '74, for instance, Cohen didn't get tenure at Rutgers after writing the book and left academia completely, I think it's important to question the reasons for the longevity of this research. Could this longevity have something more to do with the conclusions of the research being used for particular state and industry objectives? Now, this history about gaming is inserted here to seek an explanation for why scholarly work that was repeatedly refuted by certified genealogists, historians, and archaeologists has been held up as the definitive work that has decided the Ramapough's origins once and for all, despite a wealth of evidence to the contrary. Cohen's dismissal of the Indigenous heritage of the Ramapough has been disputed by a number of scholars and officials and does not stand up to scrutiny. State lawmakers may well have had legitimate concerns about the impact of gaming in the region, but their reasoning has little to bear on the claims of the Ramapough people. There are multiple letters of support for the Ramapough from federal and state officials, and many have gone on the record submitting letters and affidavits refuting Cohen's findings, most notably by certified genealogists and fellows of the American Society of Genealogists. There are so many reputable and well-credentialed figures who have refuted Cohen's book. And in that book, so many gaps in knowledge, from the missing records to the incomplete nature of the census, are quickly brushed off. But the Ramapough's own family stories, self-identification, and oral and written histories are deemed inadmissible as evidence. Once Cohen has proven through that one link he was able to make in the genealogical record to John Van Dunk appearing in the Ramapough Mountains, all Native possibilities are immediately voided. He appears to make the assumption that intermingling or intermarriage would negate any Native heritage, expecting that Native customs, traditions, stories, and intergenerational knowledge would immediately disappear. Now, this certainly is in line with the limited and truncated racial imaginaries of the time about purity and the decay that was supposed to come with miscegenation. But today, many scholars in a number of disciplines have come to understand that Native American history cannot be approached by limiting sources and evidence to colonial documentation. There is not enough of it, and much that exists is biased. This presentation has pointed to a number of significant gaps in the Ramapough Mountain People book, situating it in a social and cultural context that is inhabited by derogatory depictions of the degeneracy of mixed race communities and a longing for pure categories of identity. Such stories and narratives have served to soothe discomfort or unease about the painful history and culpability in our nation's treatment of its native peoples. Such opaque narratives obscure other stories and other evidence. The problem is not an absence of those other stories or that other evidence. The problem is the heavy and immovable presence of just one narrative. There are gaps in the evidence, and gaps are openings, places where new evidence can be considered. And there is much to reconsider about Native American history in New Jersey in light of these openings. It is likely that the Ramapough encountered and intermingled with different communities in the isolated regions of the state where they sought safety. Every single aspect of their stories of survival and continuity in the face of ongoing colonial suppression of their freedoms deserves to be celebrated, not subjected to the scientific racism that inhabits the eugenics inflected sources that have been used to define them to this day. It is important to engage in a search for archives of knowledge that exist outside of the colonial framework and that draw from Native American intellectual traditions as serious sources of evidence. Despite the brutal weight of colonial histories and national policies such as allotment and termination, much has survived and endured and still speaks back to us if we would only listen. Stories, material culture, and traditional, but not static practices and an abiding relationship with the land are present today. This is another archive. But let us also be careful not to think of this as an archive of historical documents. To do so would push connections and relationships back in time and miss the current relationships that can also be made legible in the present, as the very title of this conference reminds us. So I thank you very much for your time and attention today. And I will pass this over now to Tim Blunk to take over. And I apologize, I did get some feedback that the music was really loud, so I ended up sort of turning it down. But what I will do is I will put some links here in the chat to these two videos, which are on our YouTube channel, in case anybody would like to watch them later on their own time. So with that, Tim, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here as well and start a presentation that is more slide-based. There's no music, so you'll just hear my own dulcet tones over the airwaves. What I am going to be talking about is maybe a little bit more of a meta level of analysis here. I'm not credentialed in this. I want to just be very clear. I am not trying to pretend to be an ethnologist or sociologist or, God forbid, an anthropologist or any of those things. I'm a cultural worker and a political activist. But I do have some thoughts about this subject and have learned so much from Anita and from Chief Mann and Michaeline. And been doing my research in preparation for an exhibition that I have curated with Anita and with Lisa Levart at the gallery of Bergen Community College, which is called Gallery Bergen. And it is an exploration using photographs that were composed by a photographer named Lisa Levart, also films from her partner Miles Aronowitz, in collaboration with women of the Lunaape Nation. And we combined this with some video animations that we've created. I'll put up the chat for links for this if you'd like to see it. It's online. There's a fully 3D navigable VR version of the exhibition that you can look at online. I'll put that up in a few minutes. But we wanted to explore some of the concepts that I think art is very good at, which is exploring complexity. Things that are difficult to locate in text, things that are difficult to locate within sort of classically historical, studied narratives. And I think art can get to these more multiple phased issues that have numerous different vantage points and points of view. We put on this exhibition at a time when our college is engaged in a campus reading of Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me, and our entire school is engaged in an overarching discussion of the structures of white supremacy and how that affects everything about our daily lives, about the protest movements that have been churning and evolving over the course of the last 2 years, and particularly how they impact and affect academia and academic research. And I think that's perhaps the most cogent part of this presentation that you'll hear from me is about this premise, is how is this kind of research conducted, who does it towards what ends, and what kinds of self-criticism, what kinds of self-reflection, what kinds of interrogation are we engaged in as academics to pursue these lines of inquiry that have such incredibly profound consequences for the people who are the subjects of these investigations. This is the title piece from the exhibition that we've put on, and you'll see this is one of the photographs from Lisa Levart. There is a whole sequence of photos that she's done for the show. It's a beautifully wrought show. Again, these were collaborations between Lisa as a photographer and women of the Ramapough who were telling stories from Lunaape history, from Lunaape culture and mythology, and recreating panoramic tableaus using large format photography with encaustic and other media. What I'd like to start with actually is a letter that I've excerpted here from Kimberly McKinson, which many of you may have seen, which was published on the website Anthropology News about a year ago. And I think this is an important place to start for the discussions that I hope we'll have pursuant to this presentation. We need to examine as academics and as researchers our own lines of inquiry and the frameworks, the ideological frameworks that we pursue in examining these questions. And one of the persistent themes in the research about the Ramapough Lunaape, or actually a number of the tribes and incipient nations in New Jersey and in this area, everything has been codified and described and performed as an investigation through the lens, the binary lens of race, this artificial social construct that still seems to overdetermine so much of what we, how we see the world, our whole framework, our whole cultural framework. And I think that there are many, many artists who are just exploding this, particularly artists who are younger, who are coming to it out of their own experience. And what Kimberly McKinson talks about here is white anthropologists, and that we have to question what they study, what defines their notion of who belongs within the bounds of this canon, what's in the analytical, intellectual toolbox. She says how they structure the architectures of our departments and organizations. And racism does inflect the grammar through which anthropology makes itself legible to the world. This is just a true fact. And this is the thing that is, I think, most important in looking at the works of people like Stephen Cohen, or David Stephen Cohen and Thomas Brown, people who are, unfortunately, as academics, have spent a great deal of their academic lives trying to perform as the gatekeepers of indigeneity, and who is Indian, who is not, who is Ramapough, and who is not. And I would ask how one comes to that niche as an academic, as an indigenous gatekeeper, and under what kind of framework does that become possible? One of the things that you see pursuant to these questions is the continuation of an idea that there is some ideal type of Ramapough, of some ideal type of Lunaape, some ideal category of Indian, untouched by modernity, utterly non-contemporary. We want them to be wearing leathers, appearing on our campuses and speaking in a way that we think of as white people, as how indigenous people should act. They should have the history that we think they should have. They should have all of the touchstones of all of the documents in order, all of their history, their culture, everything in line to be able to make a presentation to whatever authorities, the state government, the federal government, the BIA, what have you. It should be consistent with the narratives that we've understood of what comprises Indian people in the United States or otherwise. And of course, this could not be further from the actual reality of who people are. It implicitly defines people as a culturally moribund people that are without life as a culture, without life as a nation, that they exist in some kind of historical frozen moment, that they are artifactual, something that we can romanticize and aestheticize. But also that leads them ultimately, of course, to complete disempowerment as active agents or determinants in their own life or their own history. And that's what's being denied here. And that's what's so significant in these discussions. We are talking about people who are living in the longest held, longest settled regions of the United States, in the most profoundly settled area of the world in terms of the consequences of white settler colonialism, the longest occupied regions of this new world. And to try and maintain this category, this fictionality of the Ramapough as this fixed categorical entity is just to deny that they have any correspondence with the real world that's in fact constantly in motion, and where in fact language and signifiers for the myriad aspects of our human experience continually evolve. One thing that I think has occurred to me throughout this exhibition and this discussion of indigeneity and of identity and of recognition, of tribal recognition, is there's this assumption that the U.S. federal government is the sole arbiter, and its agents, the BIA, is the sole arbiter of tribal or national recognition. It's just not the case. The United Nations, in fact, has a much more nuanced and evolved set of parameters for determining who is indigenous. And Latin American countries, particularly in Chile, is one I'm most familiar with currently. The whole question of how indigeneity is evolving and how cultural rights, tribal rights, how sovereignty is being discussed, how national identity is being discussed, it continues to evolve on a daily basis. It's constantly in motion. And if we can bring ourselves as people who are analyzing this in solidarity with our indigenous brothers and sisters, if we can bring ourselves to analyze this, contemporaneous evolution of these categories, why cannot we turn that prism to the past and begin to understand how all of this has happened and the violence with which this has happened. And if we are to have any meaningful discussion about reconciliation, about truth, justice, or reparations, we need to have these categories within our lens for reevaluation and for reconsideration. I also want to just point out that the fact that any group like the Ramapough have used these terrains of seeking federal recognition or state recognition, the fact that they've accessed these as a means to advance their people's cause does not mean that they necessarily accept that those terms as the final word on any of that. It's as ludicrous as saying that the entire struggle for women's liberation is like completely codified within Roe versus Wade. It's like that's the complete extent of women's liberation is held within those courts, with the hands of the Supreme Court. Of course, that's nonsense. It's just one arena of struggle. That's all that it is. I also wanted to say that the struggle for identity for the Ramapough or for the Lumbee or for the Piscataway Kainai tribes, these are not zero-sum games. And there's some unbelievable kind of notion within the academic world, within David Cohen and Thomas Brown's work, that to acknowledge the claims of identity and of recognition for the Ramapough somehow to diminish someone else. It diminishes the Lunaape as they are living now in Oklahoma and Canada and elsewhere. It's like to diminish someone else's claim to identity or to sovereignty, or somehow there's this pie of identity that needs to be equally divided, and if you come in with some claim for that, you're taking away from someone else. What I would say that in fact within the binary of race, where the primacy is white over non-white, the only thing that is diminished is the concept of whiteness. I think that's the only loser in this. And to take those sides, I think, is essentially what's at stake. As a thought experiment, what I would propose is, had the Ramapough been accorded federal recognition when first applied for, had they achieved some modicum of sovereignty and what comes with it, the ability to have international relations with other tribes or nations, would the Ford Motor Company have been so easily able to poison their land and their people? I see white liberalism just prefers victims of color over empowered actors, and all the good intentions that go with that don't diminish the consequences for people in this battle for identity. The parameters of what constitutes nationhood are not reduced, again, to static notions of genetic continuity. Implicit in this, there's this victim blaming that holds the Ramapough responsible for not rising to the level of academic, genealogical, or anthropological investigation that scholars like Cohen or Brown have been afforded. And anything that close to genealogical categories or record keeping that would have been approximating the reality of the Ramapough's experience have yet to be invented, let alone used to investigate this history. That's what we're trying to achieve. That's what we're struggling for. That's what we're trying to get to, is to set aside these categories of white supremacy that have so overdetermined all of our investigations and ideas and concepts about who we are as the human experience. So how to get past all of that language, all of those signifiers, to begin to explore this new terrain in some kind of mutuality and means of solidarity that values us equally in some profound way. That's what we're getting to. And unfortunately, academics like Cohen or others like David Ostreicher are so keen on pointing out that they're the ones who taught the Ramapough Lunaape, the Lunaape language. They're the ones that taught them their culture. The folks like Chief Mann wouldn't have any idea what the Lunaape language was like or was about, and that Michaeline would not have been able to construct the Lunaape baskets that are an exhibit in my gallery right now if it wasn't for people like them, because they're the ones who have the keys to the gate. They're the ones who gave the Lunaape their culture in the first place. It's as if these guys are saying that Trump was right, that he's as Indian as they are. And I certainly can't accept that. In academia and society in general, we're still struggling to get beyond the language of race. And concepts of nationhood, sovereignty, and indigeneity are all terrains of struggle, are all terrains of debate and negotiation within and without. But this is not the place for white academics to step in and to hold some place of power and as gatekeepers. And one of the things that I have seen in my own investigations is the ways in which the language within this racial binary seems particularly perverse and destructive when describing the multi-ethnic, cross-cultural experiences, historical experience of these people that are being investigated. I'm not going to repeat all the words on the screen. You can see for yourselves, and I apologize if any of these are offensive. I know they're offensive. They're offensive to me as a human being. But these are the kinds of words that are in the sort of the quotidian parlance to describe people who are fighting for this nationhood, for this identity. This is maybe some of the common language, but the academic language is no less harmful. In fact, you can make a strong argument that it is in fact more harmful because of the actual consequences that this language holds for people. So the scholarship that goes towards undermining claims of Indigenous identity and claims to an historical legacy, these are the things that make their ways into the halls of the BIA, into the federal government and the state governments, and these are the places where the real damage gets done. And this is how you get tons of toxic waste buried on your land, through academic studies like this. I think it's probably an even better idea to just move on to the discussion, because I'm sure that there are many folks who would like to chime in on this. And we're completely open to having this discussion and having this debate. I just want to, before I sign off, I just wanted to thank Anita, Angela Gonzalez, who could not be here with us, unfortunately, but particularly to Chief Mann and Michaeline Newton-Picard-Conklin and the Turtle Clan of the Ramapough Lunaape. So let's have a discussion. Let's talk about this.
Chief Mann, would you like to offer a reflection on this history and the impacts on your community, and then we'll move to the discussion?
Sure. You know, our community has suffered a great deal through history, you know, from the arrival of the settlers through the Iron Age, right here, where these mines were used for you know, the iron for the Revolutionary War, World War I, and prep for World War II. And we constantly seem to be fighting for our identity that has been listed and written in books. And, you know, the totality of the historical documentation that's there has never been put in one book, not even to Mr. Cohen's. And, you know, for Mr. Cohen and for any other human being who sits there to continually try to deny the Ramapough and who they are, and they want to look to the BIA and the federal government as the gatekeepers to federal recognition, or who's native, or who's Jewish, or who is you know, from another place. You know, not all of the information that they think they have, do they? And in fact, you know, the BIA admitted in federal court that the Ramapough are Native Americans, that it's never been a question. And that is in a document in the federal government that exists. Do we have to give that to them? No. Do we need to share that with them? No, because they're not the people who determine whether or not we are Native Americans, right? We determine whether or not we are Native Americans, right? The only people who can decide or claim sovereignty to who they are those people. You know, documentation is there. Everybody knows who Katona was. Everybody knows who Panis was. Everybody knows who Onyx and Tapgao and all the others are. You know, and you can see the migration through all of those original land deeds, you know, pushing back towards the Ramapough Mountains, in a place that we have, you know, lived. You know, they want to say that there was no Native Americans here after 1758. Well, that in itself is fictitious. You know, when Peter Hasenclever came across the Ramapough Mountains and came across this little Indian village where they were living in these dome-shaped hovels, that was the Turtle Clan, still there, still in the same footprint. He wrote that letter to his wife in 1764. You know, the Treaty of Easton is not a removal document. I wish my relatives who are out west and around the world would understand that, because in that Treaty of Easton, our ancestors reserved the right to hunt, to fish, to gather. And then there's one more thing that not even, you know, Mr. Cohen even saw in there. That was the right to reserve the right to strip bark from trees. Why did we strip bark from trees? We stripped the bark from the trees for our houses, and we went back to living the life that we had prior to farming, right? We didn't leave. We're still here. What about 1855, the census, local census record that shows 991 Native Americans, right? And it's even listed as white Indians, and then they even list it as Black Indians. Right? We can't sit there and just take into account somebody's own personal perception of who we are. You know, we're the people who stood in the face of adversity, you know, since contact. We're the ones that had to stand in the face of eugenics when it was created here in the state of New Jersey, in the Vineland Training School, and being faced with a public lethal gas chamber in 1923, right? That actually didn't take place here, but sterilizations did. And, you know, that public lethal gas chamber that did end up happening years later to actually David Cohen's own ancestors back across the ocean, right? But I don't deny him of who he is, you know, and no one has the right to deny us who we are, especially when they want to refer back to federal documents, and the federal document does exist where they admit in federal court under oath that we are Native Americans, right? That it's never been a question. That is what I would like to put forth. You know, people who have written these documents and written books like David Cohen's has done a great injustice to the indigenous people who have, above all things, figured out how to survive here in our homeland. It was our ancestors, the Ramapough village at Pound Ridge, where 700 of our family members were slaughtered. 130 that were slaughtered a couple days beforehand. The direct connection between who the chiefs were over there, Panis and Onyx Jr. and Katona and Tapgao. Come on, this is not an academic exercise. This is a real life exercise with real life consequences, where our children and people who are our friends are ridiculed and bullied because of the work of these people who think they know somebody who they're not. We weren't some of the first free Black landowners. We were the free first Native Americans who had Black ancestry, who had Dutch ancestry, to reacquire our lands. He doesn't talk about the fact that for 75 years, we paid taxes in 2 states, so we were not removed. He doesn't talk about that. You know, there is a lot more information and a lot more academics who support the Ramapough and have always supported the Ramapough than David Cohen. And for one of his questions that he has posted, I just want to make reference to, that he is a supporter of the Delaware in Oklahoma. Well, first of all, there was never a tribe called the Delaware. Second of all, there was never a tribe called the Ramapough, technically, or the Wappingers or the Hackensacks or anything like that. Those were place names that our ancestors used. Those were our towns. Those were our villages. And when his ancestors, the people that are of European descent, came here, they couldn't even speak our language. So they did it the best they could. So they removed the L and replaced it with an R. It's in a document, right? People smarter than me have the ability to look that up and see it themselves. This is what this is about. This is about telling the truth, telling the facts, that your efforts and the things that you're doing out there in this world, right, are causing real harm continually to these indigenous people who have, above all odds, right, outside of New York City, 39 miles, through the Eugenics, through trying to force removal, through the Treaty of Easton, through all of those things, right, are still here. Through environmental racism, still here, right? Who in their right mind would put themselves in a place like this to be badgered and bullied and to have people be so racist, right? Because that's what this really comes down to. Yes, I can sit here and say that I have blood that's in me that's not 100% Native American. There's people that are on here on the participants list that actually have that same thing. Yet they come from a federally recognized tribe. Why? Well, federally recognized tribes, most of them are the ones that gave support to the federal government. Those Indians who fought back, those Native Americans who resisted, right? Movement, forced removals. Those Indians have to fight for their right to be federally recognized, right? If we gave up all of our everything and said, okay, you know what, we agree with you, federal government, we're going to move out west, you know, that would be something. What about all of the Groats in Wisconsin with the Brothertons? What about all of the hundreds of the Groats that are out in Minnesota on the White Earth Reservation? What about all them? They don't exist? They're not Native Americans? Of course they are. Just because someone could, a matter of fact, there was even a lawsuit with the state of New Jersey over the Brotherton Reservation. The Unami people couldn't prove that they were from here. And in that court case, it says that reservation was set aside for the Unami speaking people, not the Muncie speaking people. We're not the same. We are different. Separated by 10,000 years on one of the Delaware Tribe of Indians website said 10,000 years ago, the Unami people, which is them, and the Muncie people, which is us, separated. You know, so you can't just throw all these things away. They all add up to a sum. The federal government even knows who we are. David Cohen, you know who we are. And right now what it is that you have a legacy to try to hold up. You have something that you put out there that cannot, in your eyes, cannot be changed, that cannot be turned around. It's actually speak the truth. Because it means that you, as this person who has this thing to uphold isn't right. You're one person. We're 5,000 plus. We just appeared out of nowhere? I don't think so. There's records back into the 1700s that talk about 2,500 people living in the Ramapough Mountains. There wasn't highways and freeways and trains and airplanes. Our people did what they had to do to survive, to stay here in their homeland. As the original inhabitants of this land, and you and others like you sit here and berate us when you should be celebrating the fact that we're still here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Mann. Yeah, it is somewhat shocking to think about. I mean, I know that myself and Tim showed some of these negative depictions and portrayals that have affected and impacted your community for so long and for so many generations. And I thank you also for reminding us. I think what really came through to me was our responsibility as academics in terms of how we do this work and the care that we take with that. There's many questions that have come through in the Q&A, but I thought maybe we could look at a few of them here. One of them that I think really connects to what you were just saying is, what are some ways that academics can work to reconcile their positions as gatekeepers, and how do they shift this for themselves as well as to shift the authority that others give them? I'll just do a quick response and then I'll pass it over to the rest of the panel. I mean, I think like the thing that really stood out to me as I was looking through this history and research is that question of who decides, you know, who makes this decision, and who are we as the academics and researchers, and what kind of sources and information do we draw into our research and work before we jump to these conclusions that, as Chief Mann has said, cause concrete damage to living communities. It's not just an academic question, but I can pass it over to the rest of the panel if anyone has a response to that.
Well, this is the question. I mean, this is, to me, it's maybe one of the most important questions that can be posed. It's not just for academics, but for all of us. You know, how do we sort of transform ourselves as a society that seeks to operate within this white supremacist framework? And I'm old enough as an activist actually to remember when that word was not even used. I mean, even you know, in college it was, you know, anti-racist activism, but still that just goes to show the acceptance of the word race as a viable term, which has absolutely no biological, genetic, evolutionary meaning whatsoever, but it still dominates our thinking in terms of how we analyze societies, cultures, ourselves, etc. We are locked into that kind of mode of thinking. So how to step outside of that and how to take responsibility as academics is just as fundamental as analyzing the language that we use, the terms that we use, to re-examine that. I think partly it means listening to young people, and it means listening, particularly for white people, it means listening to people of color, for God's sake. I mean, that sounds like it should be so axiomatic, but it really makes a difference when you are in the milieu of Indigenous peoples, people of color, who are having these discussions and determining things for themselves. Sometimes I think how not to be, I mean, I think one of the questions came up, or it was actually a defensive position of saying, well, I'm not a gatekeeper, you know. Well, it has nothing to do with volition. That's what I'm trying to say. It's structural. It's freaking structural. It's not whether you intend to be a good person within academia or not, or within as a researcher or not. your position within the world is functionally as a gatekeeper. So it is incumbent upon you to take that seriously as an anti-racist person, as an anti-white supremacist person, as someone who cares about other people and exists in solidarity with others. So that's maybe the most important framework. But the second thing is you have to be willing to criticize yourself. And that is what is really unbelievably absent from the researchers who continue to defend these old positions, is a complete absence of self-criticism, of self-evaluation, of acknowledge that maybe I didn't completely get it right. And in fact, there's overwhelming arrogance about credentialing, about how many degrees you have, how much study you've done. Well, if you've done nothing but study in white supremacist institutions and have done nothing to consider how that might have affected your evolution as a thinking person, then you've done nothing except achieve an Ivy League degree in white supremacist thinking. I mean, that's just the reality. So spend some time thinking about, maybe I didn't quite get it all right. Maybe it's possible that I didn't listen to all the stories that need to be listened to. Maybe I didn't take the people that I was talking to seriously. Maybe I was too afraid, for whatever reasons, because of my own ego or otherwise, to talk to people who needed to be talked to. Maybe you need to go out and do some weeding out at the Three Sisters farm with some of the Ramapough and talk to Uncle Lee and talk to Chief Mann and Michaeline and talk to some of the young people and find out for yourself what their stories and experiences are. Forget about your academic categories and your precious credentials and get real with some people. I mean, that's probably the most important starting point, is to just start to be real with people and not so about your own self and your ideas of credentials.
Yeah, I mean, that's another, there are all kinds of other archives that we can consult for sure. And I think you're kind of nodding to that a bit, Tim. One of the things, I mean, in kind of the books and the works that we've been talking about, the thing that I found so surprising is, as you mentioned, the inability to say like, oh, wait, I got it wrong. I missed something. Let's go back to this. Let's revise this. I mean, I know I have things I published, a few years ago that now I would look at in a very different way. So as you say, the ability to make changes is very important. There also were a couple of questions, and I do want to acknowledge that David Cohen did share a large number of questions in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I think we can only address one. And that alludes to the tension or conflict between the federally recognized Delaware Lunaape in Oklahoma and opposition that exists there. I don't know if Chief Mann, you would want to say anything about that and kind of connect that to the final question we have in there about the BIA and who defines Indian and how Deb Haaland's presence can change things a bit.
So, in regards to us, in regards to the Delaware, which they choose to call themselves in Oklahoma, there's a whole story that it's not just that they're there, right? There's a whole story about that migration that ended up going all the way out to Kansas, right? And how one part of that community that was just one, right? When those people broke off and went to Texas, right? They were utilized to kill the indigenous people of that space. And they were given a reservation called the Brazo Reservation. And then when the new governor of what became known as Texas took over, they told them that they had to remove from there because they were aliens. And so they moved from there and ended up going to Oklahoma, where they were absorbed into the Caddo, right? That's their own history. That's their own words. But then they become the people, the Delaware Nation, become the first ones to get their federal recognition out there. Then what ended up happening is that the rest of the body, most of the people who were in Kansas left there, not everybody, and they went to the Cherokee Reservation, and they lived on that land in the back. And the agreement was that they had to pay a certain amount of money for, per acre or per person or whatever it was, but they went for their federal recognition. The Kansas Muncie, who are still there, spoke up and fought, not even recognized by the state of Kansas, and was able to get their petition at first denied. And then they ended up getting their federal recognition. Then the Cherokees say, hey, you can't be federally recognized. You're a part of us. And it was taken away. And then it was given back to them again. So for any of them to say that they are this one thing is an impossibility. You know, first of all, they were not 9,000 tribes here in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Southern New York, and Connecticut. You know, there was 2, you know, or 3. And the one of those is the Muncie speaking people above the Raritan River, right? And, you know, those names that we have were given to us by those people who ended up referencing that place to us being those Indians. So the Delawares out west, who are proud of using the word Delawares because they resided along the Delaware River. So that's not their name. How can the government even recognize that? You know, how can the government doesn't even recognize factions of a tribe? So here we have one community that went out to Kansas, divided into 2. Now you have 2 communities out in Oklahoma, which is really one, right? And the federal government doesn't acknowledge two factions of a tribe when they're the same people. And a perfect example of that is the Pequots, because the Western Pequots have their federal recognition. And when the Eastern Pequots went to get their federal recognition, they were told no, because they don't recognize factions of a tribe. So maybe, you know, maybe the answer to all of this, right, is to go back to the federal government, to go back to the BIA, right, to go back to the Department of the Interior and address this. You know, there is a relative that was on here, and I don't know if he's still on here, but he made reference on his Facebook page that the reason why they cannot call themselves a nation is because they are citizens of the Cherokee Nation. Well, you cannot be in 2 federally recognized tribes at one time. That's not legal either. But who sets that? Who sets those parameters, right? Who sets those guidelines? That's the federal government. The very people that all of our communities fought against, all of us, whether we're federally recognized or not federally recognized, right? Whenever there's an issue within their own communities, like Kerry Holton, the former president of the Delaware Nation, when the elders removed him from being the chief, who did he go to? He didn't go to his own lawyer. He went to the federal government to have them step in to reinstate him as their chief, but the people didn't want it, right? So when they're sitting here talking about seat pain out west, they're those people who are representing it at the tribal governmental level don't necessarily speak for all of their citizens, right? And the only way that we're going to realize any kind of justice for any of us, right, is for our communities to stand on their own if they have to fight for the recognition that they deserve. You know, and the Ramapough are going to continue that fight. And every day goes by, there is other people that are out there say, oh, well, you know, what about this? What about that? What about the other thing? You know, what about Victor Jackmont's information where, you know, he writes in 1827 that the mixed blood Indians living in Green Mountain Valley settlement are related to the Indians living 300 miles away? Huh. Nobody's talking about that. David Cohen doesn't have that in his book. That's firsthand account, David Cohen, right? Victor Jackmont. That is the last free place that our people were able to live in Green Mountain Valley settlement. Those names that are not names that are in your genealogical record, right, or whatever you came up with, match that. As a matter of fact, back when we were going through our federal recognition, when Roger Jocelyn went to the University of Rutgers to the private library to actually see the work of Kate Griffith, you actually were the last one to see it. And then it disappeared, her genealogical work. And Roger Jocelyn took and redid that off of her notes. And then the BIA said, oh, that's hearsay. And Roger Jocelyn's response to that is that, you know, genealogy is hearsay, right? But I know, I'm sorry, but just to say this one more thing, right? So is the Bible. Now, people believe in the Bible that was written by a man, and I think religion's beautiful, right? But nonetheless, the Bible was written by a human being. Everybody after that person, right, had either put their own take on it and believe it, or they don't believe it. You know, regardless of whether Ford dumped in those mines or not, you're right, David. That does not say whether or not we're Native Americans, right? But our experience with the Ford family over all those years has been there a lot longer than your family has. We are who we are, and that will never change.
Thank you, Chief Mann. I think we're going to have to close on that note, unfortunately, because the organizers need to move to the next panel session. Clearly, this discussion has raised a lot more questions, and there's so much more to discuss, but I guess I'll just thank everyone for attending and just leave you with the question that we posed in the presentation, which is, what does the evidence reveal to you? And hope we can continue this conversation in other forums. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Chief Mann. Thank you, Michaeline. And we look forward to the rest of the conference. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.